2020 has been a year like no other. Something ended last year, for sure, and I do hope it is not the global world we used to take for granted. The effects of the pandemic, I think, are still to be measured, to be analyzed and dissected in books, in research, in PhDs for sure, and in blockbusters. The question is, which normal do we actually need? An old one or a new one? And so here we are with our next in a series of talks about the new normal, about the world post-COVID-19. We, being architecture, design, and urbanism oriented, are most concerned about the pandemic and how it will change the way we live in our cities, and the way we build our buildings, and the way we operate them. Each conversation in this series is focused on a single topic: public space, work life, mobility, culture and events, education, sustainability, and city planning. And today we shall talk about culture, about museums, and what the future of museums is shaping up to be. I'm Aneta Vasiljeva, an architect, critic, and educator from Sofia, and I'm joined today by Triin Ujari from the Estonian Museum of Architecture in Tallinn, by Margarita Dorovska from the Museum House of Humor in Gabrovo, Bulgaria, and by Andreas Rubi from the Swiss Architecture Museum in Basel. Hello to all of you. I'm very glad to be together today, albeit in Zoom, but where else actually? How are you? How are your museums? Open? Closed?
Hello. Our museum is open for 2 weeks now. So we were closed from Christmas until the first 2 weeks of January. And of course, it's very happy feeling to be open again because because museums by concept, by idea, are open institutions. They should they have to show their collections, their research to the wider audience. So audience is very essential. Maybe nowadays is the question, where is the audience?
Hello, our museum is open. We survived 2 lockdowns. One was the hardcore lockdown last year from March until mid-May, I think. And then we had another one from the end of November until the end of December. We've been open from the beginning of January. And what we witness is reduced number of visitors, about half of the regular visitors for this period, while at the same time during the summertime and the early autumn, our visitors slowly grew, starting from half of the regular, and in September and October we had larger number of visitors than previous years. So it's very interesting to observe this dynamics, but it's great to be open, and it's great to have audiences visiting, of course.
Our museum is closed since November, and the lockdown will go at least until end of February, and then we shall see. Basically, we know the statistics now for last year, and we had about a third, a loss of a third of our audience.
In fact, culture, along with entertainment and air travel, are said to be amongst the hardest hit by COVID-19. You all operate museums of different sizes in different locations. How did you adapt to the changes? First, to the sudden shutdown Margarita mentioned, but it was everywhere in spring, the first lockdown, and then to the open, close merry-go-round of the next waves and the state measures which followed. How did you adapt to this insecure situation?
For us, if I want to start, we basically had to adapt by not installing a show in the last year that we wanted to. We kept a show longer. It was on for at least 9 months, which is very long. And at the same time, we increased all kinds of digital formats of experience that we could have. So we were offering digital tours, like full-scale tours, the way we normally do them, which is about 45 to 60 minutes long, done by myself or my curatorial team. And we basically, we bought equipment so that we could live stream these things, record them and live stream them at the same time, and did them in 4 languages. So to increase really the accessibility for our audience. At the same time, we invented new formats of guided tours, like short tours, like 10 minutes on one exhibit, for instance, in the museum, in an attempt to give some sort of an in-depth experience, the way that you would actually stand in front of something and look at it and talk about it with somebody in an actual museum experience. So we did these kind of things, which were actually kind of nice. And we also started in the first lockdown an interview series, which we called Sam Calls, where we would call somebody from the world of architecture in a weekly rhythm. So once a week, we would talk to an interesting personality in the world of architecture and talk about let's say, the significance of COVID as a crisis and as a chance to change our society, maybe for better. So to use the crisis in a good way, which means if you're forced to question all your routines of producing and of living and of existing, you might as well use this opportunity to actually think, were these routines that we had before actually good? Or could we actually, is it also a good thing to actually throw them overboard and replace them by something else? What could we, could we use this crisis as an incentive to actually push ourselves to a change that we were too reluctant to commit before, while we're actually able to do that type of change? In that sense, we tried to develop a perspective to Corona where we said it's maybe some sort of a biologically induced sabbatical to our routines, which we should use like a normal sabbatical, where you don't have to do your normal type of work, but you have actually time to think. And you come to certain conclusions and realize, you know what? Actually, these digital tours, maybe they're not that bad, because we actually gain another access to an audience that we normally never have, because people are too far away, they cannot make the way to the museum. But through these digital means, we actually get access to these other audiences. And in that sense, COVID was this interesting, and still is, ambiguous experience, which is a pain in the butt on the one hand, but also there's some sort of promise to actually induce a change that we're capable of, but that we were not pushed enough for to actually do.
But can social media efficiently substitute the shared museum experience, Margarita?
Well, for us, it worked quite well. As a museum of humor, during the first lockdown, we show a lot of cartoons, they don't require the usual white cube situation where you are immersed with an artwork or an artifact. So social media worked quite well for us. And also it was a great research field, because you remember the amount of new memes and jokes that was brought up by the pandemic. So that was an interesting time. But now we are working on a new website so that we can much better manage the content that we are producing and the content that we are sharing. One thing that I realize is has been very, very important for all museums is that we all were forced to become more digital, obviously, a good thing. Then have we been able to really discern the best formats for the things we are doing? Obviously, it's not fine to call a video tour a virtual tour. Not all of us have the access to the necessary means to produce proper digital content. So that's quite interesting for us to experiment with in terms of exhibition making. And then, of course, the greatest question is, do you need to replicate the physical experience or online, or you need to develop a completely new type of experience of the artworks and the cultural artifacts?
Trin, what's the situation in Estonia? Did you experiment or?
Well, it's luckily maybe we have been closed for so long as my colleagues in Western Europe. So we were like locked down in spring, and then a short closing in during the end of the year. So actually, we have continued to do exhibitions. As others, we prolong our existing shows. I think maybe that's something that we are going to do also in the next year, that the exhibition runs longer and the programming has to be more dense, more more program attached to the exhibition. As others, we are doing more e-solutions, e-excursions, digital excursions, lectures. But I have a feeling that they don't substitute, of course, the exhibition, or they don't substitute the actual experience you get in the exhibition. They are something that add on to the exhibition experience. It's something that nowadays they are speaking about design thinking. That it's something that prepares visitors to come to the museum. If you see the teaser from your home, and then you come to the museum to see the exhibition, and then etc. etc. It's something that adds on to the exhibition, but it doesn't substitute it for sure. And yeah, the question is actually, I think it's even harder for the art exhibitions, because art is, by my mind, something you have to experience on site. So it's not used to see the reproductions on screen. Architecture maybe is more ambitious. It's as we know, architecture museum know very well that the architecture actually lies outside of the museum wall, and we mediate anyway in exhibition halls through the photos, through the videos, through the drawings, the experience of architecture. So yeah, for example, we do also open houses excursions, so they take place outside of the museum in the open air. We visit the houses that people normally wouldn't get access to, and we do also educational programs outside of the museum in the open air, in the interesting neighborhoods when the new and old architecture is interestingly combined, and they are very popular, I have to say. So maybe this kind of educational work and the work aimed or work targeted toward the school classes is much stronger at the moment, also because of the fact that the classes are allowed to the museum to make a group visits, and there is no number limits, because they are sitting in the classroom together anyway. So up to 20-30 children can come to the museum also as a group, which is not normally allowed for the other adults. So it's something that it is allowed in those weird times. So and we are really stressing at the moment, or doing a lot of work on those educational programs.
Are they bringing more visitors? How do you estimate the online activities and for the more diverse public you might have attracted? I want to get back to Andreas' some calls. They were indeed with very prominent figures from the world of architecture. And were they successful? What would you say? Were they watched? Were they popular?
Yeah, they were successful. I think people especially like the fact that we actually experiment and that we don't just give in and say the museum is closed, then we're basically screwed. But that we were looking for different forms of contact with our audience. I think what we basically do is we produce communication. That's what we do in a museum. And the place of this communication about the subject of our museum can be the museum, but it doesn't have to. I mean, there is a long tradition of institutional critique in the art system and also other kinds of the museum business as such, where we know the museum is also not like the most perfect, ideal environment for this kind of encounter and communication. Museums produce a threshold for those who feel less included by them, you know, people that are maybe not as highly educated as the audiences that we're maybe more used to. So many people also stay outside museums because they don't really feel welcomed. So it's not that the museum is the 100% ideal, perfect environment. It has its own problems. And actually, I think COVID is an interesting opportunity for us to live up to this institutional critique. Just the way that Trine was explaining, for architecture museums, the museum is a kind of difficult space also to begin with, because we cannot get our subject inside the museum. Buildings are too big. We cannot just transport them in museums. We're not in the situation to have comics that we can work with. So in an architecture museum, you can only work with representations of architecture, but never with the real thing. So that's the opportunity now to actually deal with the real thing and really say, let's go out, let's deal with architecture in the real world. So let's produce formats that are outside the museum and that actually bring us really close to this, to the subject. And I think you were asking before, Aneta, can the digital stuff replicate the actual experience? No, obviously it cannot. But I think maybe that's already the mistake to even want that. We have to accept that we cannot get it. To be in a museum is an irreducible experience. It's this. It's like eating meat. When you eat meat, you cannot replicate this experience by eating a vegan burger. But it's about accepting that maybe eating meat becomes more and more a problem, and we should start to like eating the vegan burger, which is something I'm trying to do. I'm trying to recondition myself to not like things so much that are maybe impossible more and more today. And maybe we should do it like the book people in the famous film by François Truffaut, Fahrenheit 451. You know, it's this 1960s dystopian movie where the possession of books is illegal in a society in the future. And the function of the fire brigade is to set fire on libraries whenever they find one. And a group of book lovers decides that in order to make books survive this terrible condition, they resort to learning their favorite book by heart. And they escape to the forest, and they live there as this kind of utopian community, all declamating their chosen book in order to make it survive. So they decide, I will become the medium of the book. My body will be the replacement of the paper that is too much in danger to be burned. And this way I will make sure that we will still have a library. We are the library. This has touched me amazingly when I've seen this in this film. And in a way, I think we have to do the same. We have to reinvent the museum. It's foolish to think that in a Zoom call or in a digital tour, we can replicate the museum. We can basically, what it does, it's a somewhat melancholical experience of that which we cannot experience in the moment. But I see it as a bridging tactic. We bridge over to another condition that we yet have to invent, all of us together, because we're clueless, basically, you know? We're not prepared for this condition. But now we have to work, and we have to really imagine what can we actually do outside the museum. You know, there was a time in the history of mankind before museums were invented and people had an experience of art, of culture. It was in a different format. And maybe right now, at least in an interim period, we have to be able to think, how can we you know, kind of keep the contact of our audience, not so much with the museum, but with what the museum stands for, with what the museum wants to cultivate, what it wants to you know, bring to the attention of people. And maybe then everything outside the museum is our museum today. Mm. And of course, we cannot charge entry fees for that, but this just shows that the entire system in which we live is at stake, the entire economical basis. And, you know, maybe COVID really tickles capitalism really badly in the moment, and that wouldn't be the worst thing either.
In May, one of my students did a speculative pre-graduation master's project on a parallel museum. Margarita is familiar with that. A network of museum capsules for individual manipulated experience, which can legitimate spaces of all kinds. Those capsules were supposed to be everywhere, in the mountain, in the ghetto, in the center, on the seaside. Do you think, all of you, we should, as Andrea said, reconsider the museum experience in general? Or is it too much to ask from a simple coronavirus?
I think we should divide the museum experience in two parts. One is the actual experience in the building of the museum. And the other is the need, the connection, the community, the expectation from the museum. And if we speak about the physical space, according to research done by Texas Medical Association, museums are graded at 4 out of 10 in terms of risk. So that's low or moderate risk. And when you examine the behavior of people in museums, it's already quite COVID precautions friendly, because usually you don't touch, generally you don't touch, and you're supposed not to speak loudly. When you speak loudly, obviously you produce more projectiles and it's more dangerous. So one thing is how we can reorganize museums to make them safer as an environment. And that's, I strongly believe in the impact of design and architecture, and what could be done through design and architecture to make safer spaces. And I think that's a great challenge. Right now we are putting up a show where all objects are spaced 1.5 meters between them. So if we have one viewer viewing a thing, they can just space them themselves, the way the exhibition is laid out. Then we can think of ticketing. We can all do online ticketing, so that you don't need to touch money, to touch cards, to touch tickets. Obviously, museums with courtyards and patios would be better positioned to organize events, especially in those climates that allow for, you know, a couple of months in the year. Reducing wall text, so again, reducing the need for people to agglomerate to read something. There are different things that we can do to make museums safer, for sure. But then the other question is the perceived sense of risk. So one thing is if we are objectively safe environments, and another thing is how we are going to be perceived. looking at the number of visitors and how they reduce after every lockdown, that makes me think that those are two completely different issues and we need to address them differently. So this is where I see the value of digital content in keeping the connection with audiences and even developing new audiences, because after the first lockdown where we were extremely active online, I realized that after that we had visitors that had never before come to the museum. So we were able to attract some new visitors. Another thing in terms of rhythm, I believe that could be changing. At least that's how we experienced it in Bulgaria last year. If the pattern would be pretty much the same in terms of months and you know, annual density of the virus situation, we had a somewhat more relaxed summer. So maybe we could think of a situation where we reverse, and summer is not the time for vacation, but summer could be the time to organize those events that really require people to go physically and to maybe be together.
Mm-hmm.
But you have one important international biennale now coming to Gabrovo, the Humor Biennale. If I'm not mistaken, its next issue is scheduled to be exactly in 2021. How do you plan to proceed? Because it is not only an exhibition biennale. Here we touch what Trin said and what Andrea said, the tactile experience of art, of contemporary art, which you usually mix with humor in this biennale. How do you plan to proceed with this?
We are moving the biennale to September, late September, and we hope that we are going to have about a month where it will be possible to physically visit the biennial and to hold more events. And after that, hopefully we are going to remain open. My feeling is that more and more governments understand that museums are not the most dangerous places. So hopefully with next lockdowns, we are not going to be among those to be locked down first.
Like theaters.
Yeah, like theaters.
Yeah.
Andreas, how about the architecture biennales?
Yes.
The architecture events. Last year, most of them were cancelled or postponed. Shall we call the whole thing off, as Future Architecture said in the spring? Because I myself personally cannot imagine the Venice crowds gathering in May, Aperol Spritz in hand, together as usually. What do you think the future of our most important events will be? Architecture, whatever.
I have a feeling these mass events will maybe not disappear, but I think they will be much less common, and maybe also much less the goal of these things. You know, it's basically a rush for quantity. You know, it's a race for more viewing numbers and 500,000, 600,000. But is this really important? Does this number say anything about the intensity and the profoundness of an individual experience of people? I'm not really sure. So yeah, I think we should at least suspend them and not feel, you know, stressed out about it. It's perfectly fine to say, okay, we're not going to do it this year. It's okay.
Do we miss them, according to you?
Yes, but we can use this missing constructively by trying to think about what we could do differently. So, for instance, you know, the Cistercian monks, for instance, in the 12th century, made this architectural rule, for instance, that they are not supposed to use kind of figurative ornamentation in their churches and monasteries that they were building, because they wanted to experience and they wanted to create an experience of the service and of religion where you're not distracted by your relationship to God. So they basically forced themselves to make an architecture where they could not use all these figurative elements, like the depiction of people and so on. But they could only use flowers, for instance, and plants and abstract ornaments. And this architecture that they made is extremely rich and figures among the most precious traditions of Western architecture. In that sense, we should be able to reinvent our museum experience based upon a no-go. So for instance, if we say we cannot have crowds in our museums, why not invent the private museum? Wouldn't this also be beautiful if I'm alone in the museum? If we invent a system where we have slots, user slots, and they make sure that for half an hour I have the museum for myself.
But what about the ticket price?
The same as before, or maybe a little bit more, because it becomes a more precious thing. Also, basically, less people would be able to do it. So you have the feeling, oh, this is really kind of a luxury. I'm getting this kind of special experience. But for the time being, I wouldn't raise ticket prices, because the most important thing is to make people understand you can still have a relationship with the museum. It is different, okay. But, or maybe, you know, it's like one person per room, and you come together with this group of, you know, our museum, for instance, we're a small museum, we have 4 rooms. So imagine you have 4 people, and they experience each other in the foyer, and then the first goes in the first space. 10 minutes after goes to the second space. The second person goes into the first space, and so on. And you have this kind of really special experience. And after it, when they come out, they may want to talk to each other in a way that they would not feel induced to talk to other museum goers in a normal condition. So I think there's actually a big opportunity to really create something new. I mean, for instance, we have theater performances in Basel for a very small amount of people. And I think this reduction in numbers can also do something positive. Maybe it makes me understand this is really not obvious. It's not to be taken for granted. This is something very, very precious, something remarkable, extraordinary. I should really pay attention to this. Maybe this is the last time I'm in the theater for a year. So I should take this, you know, with my full hands. And also maybe then the communication with the people that also witnessed it becomes very important. So somehow I have the feeling we should do it like the Cistercians. We should say, in the less is a more. And it's just unknown yet. But we're not only losing something with the corona confinements. We may actually win something, but we just don't know what yet.
Or like Fondazione Prada. Do you remember this pre-COVID exhibition, Carne y Arena, of Alessandro Inarritu, which was held in 2017, 2018?
No, I have not seen it.
Fondazione Prada in Milan, where only one person was allowed to enter this digital experience within this large hall of 7 minutes, experiencing virtual reality of Mexican-USA border, of the people passing through, of all those guards catching people, things like that, all those fugitives. This was, as I'm listening to Andreas now, some kind of prediction for the future, because it was viral. We had to book tickets for this half-an-hour experience 4 months before, and it was all sold out within 3 days for a whole year. But this is exclusive experience. It is not inclusive. It's only a fraction of people.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's also one of the contradictions here, that if I agree that in the future, the museums, like the big museums, they tend now to be a destination of mass tourism, as we know. So Louvre and New York museums, so they are like a big, you know, festivals anyway. So the number of visitors will be reducing. Of the number of visitors allowed to the museum spaces in the future is reducing, and of course it makes it more exclusive, this experience, this possibility to go to the museum. In a way, it goes back to the history of the modern museum, which is roughly like 150 years. Before that, museums were private institutions. They were chambers of curiosities. They were, you know, only very special eyes, very special visitors were allowed to those chambers. So the museums, as we know them now, are the products of this consumer mass tourism age. So it's, I think it will change. But if we speak about new audiences and engaging new target groups, and then we can't say that the new museum is only for the selected only, or that the new museum a few lucky ones, or those few ones who can enter per 1 hour or per one day to the museum. So there is kind of contradictory or contradiction here. And another thing, I have a feeling, or well, we are all now experienced for almost a year now, this constant flow of Zoom conferences and meetings and digital excursions. Actually, the digital realm or the digital world has its own specificity, and I think the studies have shown that it's part of the attention economy, in that sense that the research has shown that the average attention span is like 12 seconds only that person actually pays to the one video or something moving on the screen. So it means that all our effort actually can be also in vain, that actually this attention or holding this attention is quite important. And I have a feeling, since we all do those excursions and lectures in a quite modest budget, because budget thing is also one quite important thing, because usually we don't do ticketing for those digital events, so it means we have to do them pro bono in a way. So I want to say that this the ones who have more resources tend to make also more spectacular, more interesting, more attention-catching digital programming as well. For example, exhibition openings are nowadays something like a TV shows already, or something. So it's quite a new, interesting format. So yeah, but I think it's something we should consider, that it's quality and requirements in digital formats also is quite important to follow.
But here's one very specific opportunity for a change that could be meaningful. There's a long discussion about whether museums should be actually free of charge, because they're institutions of education. It's very important that people can go inside them and learn about things. You know, it's not amusement and entertainment, but it's basically a way of three-dimensional learning. And we know examples of museums that are actually free of charge. So for instance, in London, the big museums are public access, and only special exhibitions are not. I mean, there you have to pay something. I think this is tremendous, and actually it's very interesting, because in the COVID condition, as you were explaining, Trine, since if less people come, the museums have less income through entry prices. So it's very difficult to sustain this condition. So now might be the time to actually make a discussion with our politicians to say, look, wouldn't this be an opportunity to actually switch the system and to endow our museums in such a way that they don't need to charge the entry fees, so that then it doesn't play a role anymore if you have 10 people or 100 people in a museum on a particular day. However, the 10 people, they can have maybe the most perfect experience of a museum than that you can imagine. So for me, this is exactly the promise of COVID, that when we realize that given protocols and routines no longer work, like for instance, to make money from entry fees from museums, then this might be the final moment to actually say, come on, but we've been discussing about this point, whether this was a good idea in the first place for a long time. So maybe now we just do this for a start. And that, I think, would be the promise. So I really hope that, we just don't go back to the status quo like before, but really understand what could be actually a better alternative. And that would be one for me. And for instance, we're doing our next show is free of charge, because that has to do with the thematic, which is called Access for All, and it's about new public spaces in Sao Paulo. And we found it would be a contradiction in terms to make an exhibition about public space and the accessibility of public space within buildings. Then make an entry gate where people have to pay. So for the exhibition, we drop these charges, but we also do this in order to make people understand how would it actually be if museums were free of charge. So we use this like a case study as a precedent. And actually, I would like to have a discussion, a political discussion, about the possibility of declaring museums public space by default, and public space has no entry fee. So.
Margarita, can we do this in Bulgaria, the political discussion?
Absolutely. I think first I really like Andrea's approach where all negative consequences can be rethought and have a positive spin on them. I think that would be a great opportunity for Bulgarian museums, because very few of our museums really rely on ticket entrance income. So yes. I think that's that makes a totally valid argument. And when we spoke of exclusivity, just realized I have two interesting examples about the museum going out in the houses of people. Yesterday I was during an exhibition, a selection of artists, where we were looking into 5 artists who would produce artwork that's going to be for a short time shown in public space, but then it can be scheduled to travel to people's homes. So you can hire this exhibition free of charge for 2 weeks. And it was very interesting to me how we were thinking of a completely different set of criteria, and how the artwork somehow changes when it is to be experienced in a museum compared to what it is when it enters your private space, the space of your home. And another attempt at doing something similar would be with our next biennial, where we are going to try to provide quite a lot of the artworks to be available for smart devices like smart TVs, in the form of a slideshow. You know, we are showing a mix of contemporary art and cartoons. So for many of these works, that's completely possible, and you can have the biennial on your wall, your home.
Super. Mm. This is actually interesting because it rejoins an institutional critique of the museum from before. I remember, for instance, that since the art museum was often considered as elitist, and it was difficult to draw like a general crowd into art museums, some people, some institutions had an interesting idea and created something in Germany that's called Artothek. And that's basically a library for artworks. So a museum would take pieces out of its collection that are maybe not like super valuable, so maybe not like the most precious paintings, but maybe some prints from the graphic collection. And they would put them in a catalog where their audience, when they come to the museum, can say, I would love to have this artwork in my home for 3 months. And then, you become a member of this museum or Kunstverein or art center, and the museum then would actually give you this piece. It would lend it like a library that lends a book, borrows a book to you. And you would take this piece to your home and you hang it, or maybe somebody from the museum even actually hangs it in your living room, and you live with this piece for 3 months. And obviously this is in this is such an intense and super privileged relationship, which may cause such an affection and such a strong relationship with art for this person that you could never have in a museum where maybe for half an hour. But if you actually wake up every morning and you see this painting as you have breakfast with your family, well, maybe this creates a lifelong bond with art that every museum would be happy to achieve. But if we're honest, it's difficult for us to achieve if people only just come to us once or twice a year. And some people never ever come. So maybe this is a moment where we could say, we send out letters to the population and say, look, since you cannot come to us, we would love to come to you. And we offer you an exclusive experience with one of our pieces from our collections, which we are willing to borrow to you for a specific time. And maybe this reaches a person that has never been in our museums and says, wow, this would be actually quite interesting. Why not? Let's go for it. And then they have this experience and they grow fond of it. And after this, they have the feeling, oh, actually, you know, I'm missing this. I would love to do it again. Maybe I get another piece. Or I just go to the museum. I want to see where this comes from. I'm curious what they have else. And, you know, so this is an interesting moment. This has been invented. This practice has been invented prior to COVID as a way to react to the exclusive nature of our audiences, which are very often dependent on social status and education status. And we have a hard time, if we are honest with ourselves, to reach certain strata of the society that consider themselves not museum people for whatever reasons, mostly education, because they have never had this kind of connection in their own youth or childhood. So there is work to do for our museums. COVID, yes or no? We have to do this anyway. This is part of our job. And COVID now kind of, you know, pushes us against the wall. It's like, you know, come on, do it, do something. You cannot take it for granted that people come to you. You have to come to them. And that's what I find actually uplifting, this kind of sweet pressure to reinvent what we do. And I think this can be exhilarating, as painful as it is, not to do the kind of thing that we have been doing. And it's painful to have this exhibition that we have right now of Tsuyoshi Tane, which is a beautiful exhibition. And people cannot see it since late November. It really drives me crazy. It's very painful. But I think the only way to use this pain constructively is not to depress, but to really say, okay, then let's invent something else. The things that we have to share are too important to just sit in the corner and brood over this impossibility. We have to do better than that. You know, Robinson Crusoe also didn't kill himself. He survived because he learned how to live alone on an island. And somehow we have to also have that guts.
So the pandemic is a portal. You agree with Arundhati Roy. I love to cite this piece of hers from March, April in The Economist. The pandemic is a portal to a new world. A final round to all of you. So a new normal or an old normal? What would you say? What is the future of museums?
Well, I think nobody knows exactly, and I'm sure we can't return to the so-called old normal. As we all already discussed, there are a lot of new things which are now new normal in the museums, all those digital programs which are come to stay, I guess. So, yeah, I'm glad to hear that Andreas is very optimistic about the future and about the current situation. And of course, you have to somehow to be like that to not to go insane. But
it's a challenge. It's true.
But yeah, I think for the different museums, the future is different. For example, our museum is state-owned museum. We are funded almost 90% from the Ministry of Culture, so we are surviving anyway. We don't have to. We don't rely so much on ticketing. Of course, we it's important, but still our salaries and the maintenance costs are paid by state, and it will be paid until the state exists, I guess.
Well, that's good.
Also a question of
another 2,000 years. That's good.
So maybe how the different museums operate differently. So also if you talk about no ticketing at all, or the free entrance, or we talk about only one guest per day, so it means, of course, some financial causes to that. So it's so I think in that sense we are in a quite lucky situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about Margareta, but I think the museum will continue to transform, and I think that's the only thing that things survive in nature, right? We as persons also, we transform. We have no longer one single cell of our body composition that we had when we were babies. You know, cells die and are reborn and replaced. So we should not be scared of change. The change is really an incredible promise. I have the feeling the museum will be good if it strives towards improving the experience of the things that we want to show. And I remember, for instance, a very important study that the Tate Gallery in London did prior to their the new Tate Modern building by Herzog de Meuron. They actually, you know, in order to write the program brief for this new project, which became very, very important for them, they wanted to actually understand what are the interests of their audience. What do they want from a museum? Because they had the Tate Gallery, and then they wanted to build a new one. So, and they wanted to know how have the expectations of their museum goers actually changed, and made a fairly depth study with their audience. And the result of the study was that more people actually want the museum to use as a place to learn, and actually to have a not just to look at things as a kind of experience of beauty alone, but to really interact with it. And based on that, the Tate Gallery then developed programs where, for instance, you can have sessions in a small group in a special room where they take individual pieces from their collection, you know, and a lot of their collection is not always exhibited. So they take these pieces, maybe sometimes out of the archive, place them in this special space, and you have maybe a special situation of maybe 5 paintings. And you have a session with a curator who talks with a group of maybe 4, 5, 6 people about these things. You know, that's already a different experience. It's like a small show, like a temporary exhibition, but in a much smaller scale, much more intimate, and much more discourse embedded than simply an exhibition. And this is what I think, which I really like. Or also the fact that they realize that museums may have to become a specific form of public space in the 21st century, where public space as we know it in cities gets more and more commodified, and you have to consume something in order to be in a space and something like this. So they realize the museum maybe becomes a very important embodiment of interest-free public space. And after this study, they made this project with Herzog de Meuron, which became one of the most successful museums, as we know, in the last 10, 15 years. And that's, I think, how we should continue to do this too. So maybe like if I ran an art museum today, maybe I would say we don't need necessarily anymore a big museum building. Maybe I will send our collections on this rental basis to the homes of people, as we discussed before. If I did a museum of humor, which I think is a fantastic institution, by the way, maybe I would say I can use the format that we all know of the fortune cookie, you know, where there's this kind of thing that you get in Chinese restaurants, and then you open it and you read this kind of message. So I think this individual kind of communication is quite charming. So maybe it would be cool if I cannot have the people to come to my museum, I send out fortune cookies with jokes about COVID, for instance, because you were mentioning that there is this specific tradition. So, you know, I imagine people being in the subway, opening like an envelope where there's a fortune cookie inside, which they received at the subway station, and they read it, and it produces a smile on their faces. You know, isn't this what a museum of humor is about, right? So maybe we have to really overcome to want to repeat and maintain the formats of our institutions in favor of intensifying the effects of our work. And if we can produce the effects of our work, the ambitions, the hopes, the dreams, in different ways, maybe then that's actually okay. As much as I like the museum as it used to be, but you know, things do change. Television is no longer what it used to be. Today it's Netflix and stuff. Cars, I love driving cars, for instance, but I no longer have one because I think it's useless. I rent a car, so every once in a while when I actually need it. So I think the way that we feed ourselves has to change, because otherwise this planet is going down the drain. So maybe we should just finally understand that there is an incentive to change and to be open to change and to really think, what do we need to keep, what is really indispensable, and what can we also organize in a different way? Because ultimately it's about the experience or the result of our work that we should focus on, and not so much the way in which we get to there, because there, as we know, always all paths lead to Rome. So let's look for the other paths.
Where is the Rome?
Rome is I think what we actually want to do. So I think it's a really good moment. If our museums are closed, to go inside our empty museums. I do this every once in a while. And I'm asking myself, okay, what do we actually want to do? What did we wanted to do when we made this exhibition that nobody can see in the moment? And then I'm starting to think and to experiment and to dream. And so, you know, maybe we could also just send these people to see these buildings for real that we have in here. Or we send the we make another kind of event where the architect makes a talk about this work, or the architect makes little films of these buildings that he did, and then we share these films with our audience, and suddenly everybody would have a private VIP kind of guided tour through the built work of Tsuyoshi Tane that our exhibition couldn't have given them. So I think there's always losses and gains. And losses basically cannot be compensated. We have to accept loss. When a person close to you dies, there is no way to compensate that. But you may foster your relationships to the people that are still around you. And maybe that becomes important then. And in the same way, I think we have to accept the things that we lose, and that we lose without compensation, and use this as an incentive to foster other things and realize, where can we gain something?
I guess at the moment we don't know yet if we lose for good this unique experience of a museum, what it can give to the visitor, this encounter between art object or object and the viewer, the visitor. So you are saying that it's not longer the part of the future, but I somehow, of course, I feel bad about it. I regret it, but I can't say that that it's not going to happen also in the future. Maybe in another format, but maybe for the fewer visitors. That's for true. That's for true. I think those crowds in front of the Mona Lisa,
it's also insane. I mean,
history.
Yeah.
So, but
that's
I truly hope that also in the future people can come to this space where everything is curated and coordinated in that way, that your experience is, from the art object for the exhibition as a space is a maximum, or it's somebody has taken care of it, that you get at best emotion out of it. So this kind of physical thing, I think it's still very important, and also in the era of digital tools, we still need physical encounters.
Yeah, true.
So embrace a healthy change. I agree. Margarita, final words from the Bulgarian perspective.
Final words, definitely we should go for the new normal. I think we should, of course, we all stare at ourselves, suffer, but we need to stare carefully also at our audience and understand that the condition of people has been changing. And this has been really trying time in psychologically, emotionally for many people. It's for us as a Museum of Humor, it really gives a strong sense of responsibility about the role of humor in these kind of times. And definitely this could be a hint for other museums as well, to use humor in their communication and in their approach.
Very true.
So I would like to conclude with this. The pandemic is not bad. It is a way of change. It is a prospect. It is an opportunity. And museums are the new kinds of public space. I would love to see this coming. Thank you all, Margarita, Trin, Andreas, for taking part in this talk today, and hope we shall keep in touch in the future.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Yes, I enjoyed it too. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.